Okay, next up is Commander Gillie. That's Commander Gillie. He used to be Lieutenant Commander Gillie.
I like the two better.
Yeah, he was just promoted to commander. What was the date? Wednesday the 21st. And they held a ceremony. He's too modest to toot his own horn, so I'll do it. They held the ceremony on the USS Constitution at Sail in Boston Harbor on her birthday. That's right. Very appropriate place to do it. His whole life has been one giant devotion to the Constitution. Everything he does, everything he breathes the Constitution. He lives it. He walks it. He was with us. I liked it in green. Like I said, he's the guy out there in his dress uniform, standing right there for the whole world to see in the bright sunshine, with the rest of us renewing his oath. And I think it's a model example of what an officer should be like. I've had active duty officers email. One guy, one retired general, had his lawyer contact me to ask whether or not involvement in this organization could impair his pension. And so I told him, I said, look, when the day comes when involvement in our organization is going to cause you to lose your pension, that's the day you'll probably be leading men again. So don't worry about it. So my point is that you should stand up and do what you have to do right now. And Commander Gillie is a very good example of that. He's very upstanding. He's a model officer and gentleman, and we're very proud to have him as part of Oath Keepers.
All right, now you set me up, Mr. Stewart, because really, I'm a very mediocre as much as I hate to admit I'm a man of mediocre talents, some talents, some significant talents, but like most people, I'm not extremely talented, not a wonderful leader, although I think I'm a leader. I am, I hope, to be able to say a man of inordinate fidelity. And I remember in boot camp, I was enlisted for a while. I remember in boot camp, getting abused and beaten and everything. And I can't remember what the particular issue was, but the commanding officer of that, you got these company commanders, who run a company of recruits. And he did place a trust in me. And I ended up being second in command of this, recruiting company. All of us wet behind the ears, recently civilians, now suddenly seamen in the Navy, And I do recall thinking, it's more important to be trusted than to be loved. And whatever my, really mediocre talents, there are a lot of people in the Navy who have a lot greater talents and better leaders. I hope there is no one who is more faithful. And I can tell you that I've been faithful my entire 20 years career. And that is very important, although not a sufficient quality, it is a necessary quality in any public servant in this life. So I'm going to talk to you briefly before I give you an opportunity to take this publicly, those of you who wish to do it. And I want to put it into the context. Tell me if you can't hear me right. Is it right? You can hear me just right? Okay. I want to put it in the context of history. We are not the first oath keepers.
The mic's not working.
What's that?
The mic's not working.
Oh, it's not even the...
No.
Okay, somebody else. I'm a techno idiot, so someone else has got to fix that.
Justin, no, it's not.
You have to get your mouth right up to it.
Do you have to turn it on?
Seriously.
Yeah, it's dead as a doornail.
Check the plug.
So we're helpless.
Can we go get someone to fix it?
Adam, check the outlet power.
Commander Gillie, may I suggest that you switch to your command voice volume?
A little hard to maintain for over an hour.
Oh, I can do it, but I prefer to be mild-mannered.
Was there a command voice in the Navy?
I must have been a Marine asking that. Because compared to the lowliest Marine, every Navy admiral's a sissy. All right, well, while he's going to try to get a battery, we're going to march on. Let me set a little historical context, framework here. Obviously, we're not the first oath keepers in the early years of the Republic. Almost every oath taker was an oath keeper. That relative percentage has gone in the wrong direction for a while. But interestingly enough, in the earliest years, those better Americans than ourselves, and that's a considered statement, if you study those first several generations, they're almost a different species compared to ourselves. And that's sadly, that's rectifiable. They were all understanding that because they had all agreed amongst them on the fundamental law of their land, the Constitution of 1787, despite whatever differences they had, and they often had vehement differences with each other on various issues, even in the earliest years of the Republic, they always coalesced, always rallied around the Constitution. One of the earlier crises in our Republic's history, you may recall, was the Quasi-War with France and the XYZ affair. At that time, you had none other than the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States in violent disagreement all the time on fundamental issues of how to defend their country best. What was the best policy in peace and war? And the country was split down the middle in kind of camps known as Federalists and Republicans. And so, crisis and disagreement are nothing new to this country. The thing that was impressive then, though, was the way in which, at a moment of crisis, from New Hampshire to Georgia, people began, first in trickles and then larger numbers, to realize, wait, we all agreed in 1776 on our Declaration. We all agreed in 1787 to 89 on our fundamental law that now is the supreme law of our land. As long as we all rally around that, we will get through this, because we all agree on our fundamental law. All of us who are public servants have sworn to uphold this, and all of us who are citizens have a deep stake in the survival of this wonderful constitutional government. Does that make any difference?
Yes.
Oh,
We're down to it.
So, as early as the crisis of 1798, let me tell you what happened. Back then, because we were a little bit more faithful in maintaining our militia institutions, which we've allowed to crumble into insignificance, everywhere in the country, every month, you had people drilling, right? Drilling, mustering, showing that they were prepared to do their duty in their precinct, in their town, in their state, etc. And what began to happen is on their monthly drills, when they were through their drills and musters and inspections, the officers of those militia units all publicly re-swore their oaths to the Constitution of the United States. And then they adopted resolution speeches that they sent to the Congress and the President, telling their public servants in Washington that they had done this, and telling them that they understood the significance of this. And presidents having come a long way down since then, it was perfectly natural for the then President John Adams to return formal addresses to each of the groups, first militia officers, then other groups of public servants and private citizens, who had publicly gathered to publicly take oaths to support the Constitution of the United States, and sent him addresses to that effect. He answered all of those, and I've read a lot of those, some of them in his own hand. And let me just read briefly the address that was sent to him by the officers of the 1st Brigade, 3rd Division, Militia of Massachusetts, some of whom I surmise by part of John Adams' response, though I do not yet know it, and I've tried to research it and have not yet established. Some of them, I surmise, had actually fought there on Lexington Green on 19th of April, 1775. If not they, their fathers had. Let me read to you the address of those officers on the occasion of renewing their oaths to the Constitution of the United States on the sacred ground of Lexington Green. To John Adams, President of the United States of America. Sir, in reviewing the history of our country and comparing it with the convulsed state of Europe, think about peace, safety, liberty, order, lawfulness in America. Think about the chaos, tyranny, treachery in Europe in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Think of that contrast. When we find the strongest reason, I'm making that comparison, to rejoice in the local designation assigned us by Providence, we feel a pride in the name and character of Americans. It is our glory to be the descendants of ancestors who purchased freedom and independence by their wisdom and valor, and some of whom, on this spot, exhibited to the world an example of the unconquerable spirit of freemen. Again, one of my reasons for thinking that was some of their literal ancestors. May we be inspired with firmness to imitate their virtues and maintain the inheritance purchased by their valor. It is impossible sufficiently to estimate the government under which we live. It has been established by our consent and administered by our choice. We ought to make it the pole star of our conduct, and it will prove the ark of our safety. It claims our reverence and demands our support. With the keenest sensibility, we feel the insults it has experienced, and as American soldiers in the presence of our standard, we here solemnly declare that we will ever be ready to be the guardians of its rights and the avengers of its wrongs. And, having sworn when we accepted our commissions to defend the Constitution of the United States, we now, on this memorable ground, renew to you, sir, and our country, this sacred oath. We offer to you, agreeably to act of Congress, our individual services, and pledge our lives and all that is dear to us for the support of the government and the defense of the country. That you may live an ornament to the land which gave you birth and a blessing to the world is our sincere wish. We are, in behalf of the officers of the 1st Brigade and 3rd Division of the Militia of Massachusetts, your most obedient servants, and leading the signatures are the Commanding General of the Division, William O., Major General. By the way, his nephew and adopted son was one of our greatest naval heroes and commanded USS Constitution. I visited the other day, so that's great stuff. And J. Walker, Brigadier General. Lexington, Massachusetts, October 2nd, 1798. Now let me read to you then President Adams's response. I have this in his own hand. I went up to the Massachusetts Historical Society and had images made, and I've since had it blown up for teaching aids, so when you get a break, feel free to peruse them. This is in John Adams' own hand. For the first American in his family, you can understand this means a lot to me. I've actually handled the pages in the Adams papers. This is Adams' response. To the officers of the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division of the Militia of Massachusetts, gentlemen, I have received from Major General Hull and Brigadier General Walker your unanimous address from Lexington, animated with a martial spirit and expressed with the military dignity becoming your character and the memorable planes upon which it was adopted. Now listen to this contrast in this lesson in civics, the superiority of our civic order and our civic virtue in this country. While our country remains untainted with the principles and manners which are now producing desolation in so many parts of the world, while she continues sincere and incapable of insidious and impious policy, we shall have the strongest reason to rejoice in the local designation assigned us by Providence. But should the people of America once become capable of that deep simulation towards one another and towards foreign nations, which assumes the language of justice and moderation, while it is practicing iniquity and extravagance, and displays in the most captivating manner the charming picture of candor, frankness, and sincerity, while it is rioting and rapine and insolence, this country will be the most miserable habitation in the world. Why could we descend from the most blessed country in the world to the most miserable? He tells us why. It's because we have a mild government of laws, but that is dependent upon civic virtue. Because, he says, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, and revenge or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Those are the chains of the Constitution that Stuart was referring to. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. An address from the officers commanding 2,800 men, consisting of such substantial citizens as are able and willing at their own expense completely to arm and clothe themselves in handsome uniforms, does honor to that division of the militia, which has done so much honor to their country. Again, that little phrase is what makes me think that some of them or their fathers had actually fought at Thomas and Green. His final paragraph, which is what is found on the back of all the Oath Keepers' shirts. Oaths in this country are as yet universally considered as sacred obligations. That which you have taken and so solemnly repeated on that memorable spot is an ample pledge of your sincerity and devotion to your country and its government. Quincy, October 11, 1798, John Adams. Think about those words as you think about availing yourself of this opportunity publicly to renew or take for the first time an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. Oaths were then universally considered sacred obligations. Can we, by any stretch of the imagination, say that's true today? How many of your congressmen, how many of your state legislators, how many of your police chiefs, how many of your, sadly, military officers, how many of your other public servants, how many of your judges and justices consider that oath a sacred obligation? I am ashamed to say that I, in my career, worked for a while for a sub-cabinet official who had the rank of cabinet. So even though he wasn't a secretary of Umpty Squad, he had cabinet rank. And he was a good man. And on the occasion of his being nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and appointed by the President to that office, and receiving his commission to act in that office, what did he have to do as a condition, Article 6 of our Constitution, to assume the office? He had yet to swear that oath, right? Well, bless her heart, our head of public affairs, because every major agency in the government now, unfortunately, has a public affairs office, put out wonderful programs and invitations for people to come to see him swear his oath. I'm ashamed to say, and I remarked on it then, that it was advertised as this person's taking the ceremonial oath. Have any of you served as a witness in a criminal trial, as a jury member? Have you ever been invited to take a ceremonial oath? This is not a ceremonial oath, it's a requirement, the first requirement of our law for everyone. And it is nothing like a ceremony. It is a legal obligation. You are calling God, the Almighty, to witness what you have just said you were going to do or not do as a condition of this great public trust. So I wanted to frame what I'm inviting you to do now in that kind of seriousness, because it is something serious. It was once understood to be such, and sadly not quite as broadly understood, and that is, of course, part of the mission of oath keepers, to reinvigorate that conscious fidelity throughout all our public servants. So, again, we do not pressure, don't want to twist any arms. I'm going to read to you in advance the oath that we will be taking so that you can think about it, whether you want to take it or not. As Stuart mentioned, it's modeled on the officers' oaths. The officers' oaths and enlisted oaths and police officers and legislators' oaths, they're all slightly different according to various statutes. But they all have one thing in common, which is required by the Constitution, Article 6, and that is that they swear to support the Constitution of the United States. Let me read to you the words so you can think about whether you want to do this or not, and then I will administer it to those who wish to. I, state your name, David R. Gillie, do solemnly swear, and if any of you, for religious objections or otherwise, prefer not to swear, you can say affirm instead of swear, that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, pledging my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor. So help me God. So, those of you who would like to, I invite to stand. And as I pause, fill in your name, please, not mine.
Mike Robert.
Please repeat after me. I, David R. Gillie, do solemnly swear
Do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I take this obligation freely,
that I take this obligation freely,
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
pledging my life,
pledging my life,
my fortune,
my fortune,
and my sacred honor.
and my sacred honor.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Okay, break, as we say in the Navy. Transition, I'm going to give a brief presentation. You know that's a lie, I've never been brief in my life. Stuart may have mentioned that if I have a forte, it's the constitutional civic order of this country. I am the first American in my family, and perhaps because of that, perhaps because of the passion of thankfulness for the incredible blessing of being born an American, I am a bit of a civics denier. And I may be the only person, sadly, that you have met thus far, and I hope I will not remain the only person, who has memorized the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States with all its amendments. I say I hope I will not be the last, because I hope to come up, we go to these presentations around the country, and I encourage people, and I hope to come up to some presentation shortly and have you come up to me and say, hey, David Gillie, I don't remember anything you said to me except your challenge, and I want you to know that I went home and I memorized the Constitution of the United States with all its amendments. I went home first and memorized the Declaration since it was much easier. And then that inspired me to memorize our fundamental law. I hope that that will happen to me soon. I believe in David Gillie's world, every state would have that as a qualification for citizenship and voting, proved to the granny at the desk, the election judge, by reciting in front of her the entire Declaration and the Constitution of 1787, with all its amendments before you're admitted to vote. But that's in David Gillie's world. I promise you, from experience, and those of you who are old enough to have gone to school when they memorized Longfellow or memorized anything worthy, that when you have something that's masterful, rhetorically, its architecture is a masterpiece. The very act of memorizing it teaches you why every word is the word it is and not another word. I promise you from experience that you will have a deeply educational experience if you take my challenge by first memorizing the Declaration and then the Constitution of 1787. You will come to appreciate in the act of saying it wrong and then checking yourself and then saying it right and then asking yourself, why did he say of here but from there? That the choice of every word and every aspect of the rhetorical architecture of both documents is very deliberate and very ingenious. There is not so much as a preposition chosen carelessly. So, that's my challenge. Okay, I'm going to talk about just one aspect of how marvelous our civic order is. It applies to oath keepers and oath keepers commission. One aspect of many in which our civic order is the superior to every civic order that history tells us of. And I couch it that way because there's, of course, lots of world history that we'll never know because the history is lost to us. But of the history that has come down to us, there is nothing that compares with our constitutional order. I'm going to talk about one aspect that consists of a principle and a constitutional form mechanism that together, hand in hand, create one of the superiorities of many of our civic order compared to any other, and it specifically goes to the heart of the Oath Keepers' mission. History teaches us that when you found a republic, one of the most dangerous things you can do to jeopardize the existence of your republic is to create and then maintain for a generation or two or three a large standing military establishment. History is full of that. All of our pre-founding, founding, and post-founding generations understood that, lived and breathed it, and spoke it, argued about it all the time because they understood that. Many are the republics that have expired through the abuse of a large standing military force. In the sad history of these republics, one reads again and again how one or both of two civic orders, with seeming inevitability, overcomes the body politic as a cancer overcomes a body politic and then kills it. I call these twin disorders, these twin cancers, Caesarism and Juntoism. Let me describe what I mean by Caesarism. Under Caesarism, the executive prostitutes the military force that is at his command to his own private purposes. He overawes and or replaces the legislature and the judiciary. Why do I call it Caesarism? Think about Caesar. I'm going to read you, to bring back to your recollection, several of the most serious of the charges against then King George III of England, who was indulging in the civic vice of Caesarism. And it was the sins associated with Caesarism that formed part of the compelling reasons which impelled us to a separation, creating our own body politic. Think about those, and think about the last 10 years, think about the last year especially, of our civic life together, and find which ones have tragically reflection in our day. When I grew up, I never thought this would be possible to ever think that there would be analogs in our day to these abuses. But if you think and examine and reflect, you will realize that we live in an alarming time. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Thank God that hasn't happened yet, that without the consent. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. Giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, that means he as king signed legislation passed by Parliament that was unconstitutional, that assumed powers nowhere belonging to Parliament, for these purposes: for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment, for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Going back to things the kings did alone, he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. That's Caesarism. You think back on that picture in your mind, the danger of Caesarism. Think how Caesar killed his country. Think how Charles Stuart convulsed his country, plunged his country into civil war by indulging in Caesarism. Now think of the opposite, but equally fatal disease called Juntoism. Usually if I say Juntoism, you probably think of some place in Central or South America, don't you? Because it has become so common throughout the history of all governments in South and Central America to see some junto, okay? Some group of senior military officers who unseat or kidnap or assassinate the executive of their country. They arrest and confine or dismiss the legislature and judiciary. Think about that. Sometimes they do it under the pretext, and sometimes it's an honest pretext, that there was a problem of Caesarism. The chief executive was becoming a Caesar. And so they only did it because they saw no other recourse. Is that not the excuse of Brutus and the conspirators? And Shakespeare tells us, and I think he's right, that Brutus was indeed an honorable man. Perhaps more so than some of his compatriots. They all operated from a mixture of motives and intellectual framework. There was no man who was wholly good, no man who was wholly evil. But they could, and some did, plausibly claim that they had no other choice. Under their constitutional order, there seemed no choice to arrest lawlessness in the chief executive, except for lawlessness on their part. What a damnable choice to have to ever make. And many other countries in history, where after prolonged deterioration of the civic order, you had a vice of Caesarism countered by a vice of Juntoism, and it almost always ends disastrously. The only exception I can think of all history where anything halfway good came out of it, and it was only after bloody civil war, and yet the consequences were still not ironed out wholesomely for many decades, was the English Civil War. And it's instructive that many of the lessons of our constitutional order, particularly as they distribute and control the military powers, are direct lessons from the English Civil War, where you had men who thought, I have no choice. I must violate the law to save the law. Or you may have had some chief executive who thought he saw a nascent Juntoism, who then became a Caesar to arrest that. What kind of a choice is that? Yet every civic order, so many of them in history, have at various times in their history been confronted with that horrible choice. We have from our fathers a great trove of wise warnings against maintaining a large standing military establishment, except under the most compelling of necessities. However, knowing too well our own human failings, we have not relied alone on these wise warnings to secure ourselves and our children from the awful tyranny that inevitably follows in the wake of the folly of maintaining for too long a large military establishment. Not by any means. We have afforded ourselves some other safeguards, and I'm going to speak of just two of those. There are others. I can speak about this all day. U.S. Constitutional and civic mechanisms and genius are my favorite subject. In exercising our right, to use the language of Declaration 2, institute new government, we have instituted more wisely than any people of which known history gives record. Quote, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to us seem most likely to secure our safety and happiness. In this case, safety from the twin but opposite evils of Caesarism and Juntaism. I wish to speak today of one of those principles, and that principle is the principle of the use of oaths to bind servants down to their correct duty and not to anything else. And to the form, the feature of form, or the mechanism, the constitutional mechanism, that I will call unitarity in the executive. And together, this principle of using oaths to bind people down to their duty, and this feature of constitutional form of unitarity in the executive, together in combination, create a marvelous civic miracle that makes Caesarism and Juntaism all but impossible. Not impossible, but all but impossible in our country. Of course, it also makes similar problems in the use of police power next to impossible. But my thing being military, I'm going to stick to the military here. So I will restrict my application. Let me talk about the principle of constitutional oaths. Before I do that, let me just remind us, we've got this great richness, and I can go on all day about the constitutional genius in our civic order. We've so many redundant safeguards to our liberty, haven't we? And I'm going to speak of just these two safeguards. But let's remember what the Lord taught us when he asked, for what doth it profit a man if a gift is bestowed upon him and he receive not the gift? Behold, he rejoices not in that which is given unto him, neither rejoices in him who is the giver of the gift. So, we may be the richest people in the history of the world civically, in that we have the richest civic heritage. But if we are utterly ignorant of it, even while it's standing there in broad daylight, we have only ourselves to blame and we derive no benefit from it. So, let's talk about this principle of constitutional oath. That is so important. Stuart talked about this. The principle of the oath is itself an advance in civic science. And many great countries in the past have used that principle of the oath. But they didn't take it to where we took it. They always had an oath to a person or to an office. And you all understand the folly in that, or the inadequacy of that. America alone, we have instituted this thing where we bind every officer at the federal and the state level, judicial, executive, legislative, to an oath to support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That is a marvelous principle. Okay? Now, let me just talk briefly about what I call this feature of constitutional form. It has something to do with how we organize the powers. Okay? That is what we call unitarity in the executive power. Now, some of you heard, in the last year ago and a few years leading up to that, presidential press secretaries and other lackeys talking and propounding constitutional doctrines under the phrase unitary executive that have no place in our Constitution, that are absolutely heretical to our constitutional order. Nevertheless, the very real feature of form in our executive at our national and at our state levels is unitary. And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to do a little demonstration here, and I hope I make by this object demonstration, I hope I make it a little clearer, my point. But I want you to know that this principle of binding officers down by oaths and this feature of constitutional form of unitarity in the executive are just together one of several marvelous lessons that we derive from the bloody English Civil War and all the rest of history, but most proximately from the bloody English Civil War. Okay. Here's my funnel. I didn't have a funnel, so earlier I made myself a funnel by taking one of these styrofoam cups, and somebody in his goodness saw fit to clean it up, so I had to make another one. This big, thank you, I appreciate it, but you didn't know what I was doing there. Probably some kid was playing with it, right? Okay? Let me talk about it. What do I represent? What do I represent in this analogy? I represent the people of the United States, who under God are sovereign and have the natural right to create a government, and have done so. And in doing so, we have constituted it, that's why we call it the Constitution, in such and such a way. And in doing so, we have poured water into a pitcher. The water that we have poured into this pitcher is lawful authority. Okay? The pitcher itself is what? The vessel in which we have lodged it, by which we have contained it. We call that the Constitution of the United States. Okay? We have a funnel. This is a funnel, okay? It's a homemade funnel. It is a funnel or a conduit. This represents, at the national level, the President of the United States, and I will tell you why. And we have lowly public servants. In this case, the sick to military, we will say Ensign Gillie, or Commander. Or we will say Seaman Gillie. Okay? Any authority that Seaman Gillie ever exercises in our country in uniform, he gets, by one means and one means only, the people of the United States, his sovereign masters, pour the authority that they deem and how much they deem in the vessel that they deem and how they deem it to him via a conduit, a unitary conduit, a funnel, the President of the United States. That is the only way Seaman Gillie will ever be able to do any lawful act. Note that the sum total of what might ever be entrusted to him is a subset of the subtotal that you, his sovereign masters, have deemed to put in that pitcher, and no more. Right. Nothing beyond what you have put in here can ever get to him. And none of it will get to him except by the mechanism that you have ordained, this vessel called the Constitution, and except through the conduit that you have ordained, the President of the United States. That is what I mean by unitarity, but also you see the principle that he is bound by that oath, as is the funnel, the President, and everyone who stands in between in that unitary line. Each of them has only a subset, and only that subset that you have ordained through your Constitution of the authoritative water that you have deigned to give him through that mechanism. It is impossible for the conduit to ever rise above the level of a conduit. He is not an independent source of lawful authority. Right. He is utterly dependent on what you have deigned to give him through the vessel that you have ordained. That portion of authority, of your sovereign natural authority that you have deigned to entrust to his exercise, you have done to this vessel and this vessel only. And he receives it only as you pour it to him. And he holds that office on condition, as does every other executive officer and executive servant. There are a few millions of them in our country. On condition of an oath to this vessel, outside of which he will not presume to step. Can you see how that principle and that feature of constitutional form are ingenious? Can you see how they almost forfend any possibility of Caesarism or juntoism in our country? I say almost, because as John Adams reminded us, ours is a constitution that's fit only for a government of moral and religious people, because you have to have some percentage for whom an oath is sacred. If they're all like most of the politicians you know, well, there is no recourse as far as that is concerned. Okay?
Very good.
We have some people who are going to read for us right now to illustrate, first of all, the principle of the requirement of oaths. Jennifer Terhune, are you still there? She's going to come up to us and she's going to read to us the first section of Article 2, last clause of our Constitution. This is part of the creation and binding of this funnel, this president. And then she's going to read to us Article 6, the last passage. Yeah, give 1 minute pause.
Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Special oath for the president himself, okay? Because the reason that's a special oath for him is because he is that conduit through whom all executive authority, okay, is exercised.
The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Bob Lickert to come up and read us from our fundamental law about the unitary principle, unity in the executive. First, he will read to us Article 2, the very first sentence of Article 2 of our Constitution.
The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America.
So, how much executive power is lodged in the Secretary of State? How much executive power is lodged in the Vice President? Zero. The executive power is vested in the President of the United States, and we will see now the process by which he can, with that executive power, empower me or somebody else to do something with an executive. Bob is now going to read for us Article 2, Section 2, the first sentence.
The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States.
Okay. Now, how does it come to officers? Because you must be an officer to command anything, right? How do you get to be an officer in our system? Bob's now going to read for us Article 2, Section 2, second clause, second phrase about nominations and appointments.
He shall nominate he shall nominate, pause. All other officers of the United States. Oh, you want all of them? Okay. He shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which be established by law.
Thank you. And finally, he's going to read to us Article 2, Section 3, the last sentence of Article 2, Section 3.
He shall commission all the officers of the United States.
How does Commander Ensign Gillie come by any executive authority if not through the President of the United States? Who first nominated him, then the Senate approved, then he appointed him, then he commissioned him. Okay? Now, the Constitution has an escape clause after that phrase I had in read before that says, if Congress, in creating an office, Congress creates some offices, a couple other offices are established by the Constitution itself. If Congress, in creating an office, considers it an inferior office, then there's an escape clause. Congress can vest the appointment of that officer in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. Otherwise, the default position is you must first nominate, then the Senate has to choose, then he appoints. But with all of them, he then commissions. So even if you're an inferior officer, the most inferior officer, like an ensign in the Navy, and we have jokes in the Navy about lower than whale poop, okay? That's an ensign. Nevertheless, you hold the commission of the President of the United States. You are powerless to do anything without his telling you to do it, either tacitly or by prior instruction, or explicitly. But you are also powerless by that first principle we talked about. You are utterly powerless to do anything which never came through this funnel to begin with. And it can only come through that funnel If you, his master, have deemed in the vessel that you ordained to put some water in there and allow it to be poured to him through the president. Hope I made that clear. How genius. How might it have been different? Well, we could have had no oaths. Officers could be unaccountable to anything but their own passions and their own conscience. And usually we confuse our passions with our conscience, don't we? Because we are human beings. We love to lie to ourselves. There'd be no temptation to act as a law unto himself. No check on the temptation to act as a law unto himself. Okay, that's pretty primitive, pretty barbaric. Well, we could have had him swear an oath to the Fuhrer, or to the decider, or to the leader, or to the Messiah, or to the premier, or to an actual person. Johnny Doodle, Sally Smith. We could have done that, couldn't we? Well, we would have had a check against Juntoism, right? Because all the officers being beholden to the executive for their power, but we would have had no check against Caesarism under such a mechanism. What if we had oaths to the Constitution, as we do, which is a light year ahead advance of any other civic order? But we could have had distributed executive power. Some of the states in this union, before the Constitution of 1787, after the war, they got into a ferment. People re-examined their constitutional orders, and they remade some of the state constitutions. And before that happened, there were several of the state constitutions that had a distributed executive power. And the reason they did that was because they were trying to guard against Caesarism that they had seen on the part of King George. And they said, well, we got to make the executive weak by distributing it, dividing it. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is, let's suppose you have the most virtuous of men, which of course we'll never get as public servants. But even if you had the most virtuous of men, wouldn't they all read their constitutional writ slightly differently? Wouldn't they be open to even honest disagreement? Look at every state in history that has a distributed executive. Look at all the parliamentary systems in Europe. They have an inherent imbecility. Inherent imbecility, and with imbecility comes chaos and injustice, and with injustice comes slavery. And that is born of the inherent imbecility of having a distributed executive. So, if we had done that again, we would have had likelihood of honest disagreement. It would have prevented quite effectively Caesarism. It would have been no guard against Juntoism, because the military forces would have been disgusted eventually with that kind of imbecility. And you would have executive officers pretending to command each other and to call each other back in the line. Okay, we don't have that in our system. Okay, in our system and in our system alone, it is thankfully, blessedly, never required and never justified for Seaman Gillie or Admiral Johnson to raise his hand against the chief executive, who is also the commander-in-chief. Because whatever authority he has by his commission and by those other elements of funnelness. And because he has sworn that he wears that uniform and carries that awesome military power on condition of an oath to that Constitution, which includes the description of that unitarian. At the same time, he is utterly powerless, while he is in conformity with that oath, to do anything unlawful, because it is impossible to come into that conduit anything that you haven't put there in that vessel. If he makes it up, if the guy in between makes it up, if the guy below him makes it up, it's still made up. It's a mirage. It's a nullity. It doesn't exist. No lawful capability. And so when Seaman Gillie receives an unlawful order, it is his place to say, sir, why are we doing that, sir? How are we doing that, sir? By virtue of what authority? Respectfully, sir? And if it's an admiral or a general, it doesn't matter. Same thing. Persuading our fellow servants and persuading our superiors to step back within the bounds of the law that they swore an oath to protect and defend. Crisis averted. But if even persuasion and careful, respectful remonstrance fails, thankfully, in our country, there is neither necessity nor excuse for him to stand up and try to become a law unto himself, because he can't do nothing lawfully under that oath except by command that came down through that chain. Okay? And I'm convinced the principle here is it does not require faithfulness on the part of all public servants. To dream of such would be fools. It would be the greatest folly on the part of Americans to dream that we would ever have all of our public servants faithful. There was a time when most of them were faithful. But it would be folly to dream that they would ever all be faithful. But by the very process of remonstrating, a large portion of those who are out of the lawful bounds will be brought to their innocent recollection, if that's what's necessary. Oh gosh, thank you, Seaman Schmuckatelli, for reminding me and pointing out. Or, Seaman Schmuckatelli, you're causing me a problem, doesn't matter. By Seaman Schmuckatelli, standing up and just pointing out, politely, respectfully, the utter absence of any authority and his utter captivity to his oath to the Constitution. There are rings, safe, concentric rings of thinking and remonstration and epiphanies that happen within the ranks safely. And if ultimately our public servant, our military public servant, has no other recourse but to resign, that resignation creates ripples in the press, in the public. They reverberate and they enlarge as when you throw a stone into water. And they have a high proportion of chances to awaken other officers to their duty. And that has a higher proportion. This is what Oath Keepers is doing. We're trying to multiply the deliberate, knowledgeable fidelity to our oaths among our public servants. It doesn't always work. Let's talk about Michael New. Michael New, of course, didn't have the luxury of resigning. I didn't go into that. An enlistment can't resign because he's sworn to serve for a set period of time. The reason we constituted officers the way we did was so that they could resign. They serve the president's pleasure, but at the same time, he has their services at their pleasure. Okay. But Michael New, of course, was only D4, and he was enlisted for a term of years. He received an order that violated about 5 clauses of the Constitution, violated 4 or 5 statutes, and violated a couple of regulations. Everybody in his entire battalion went along with this unlawful order from the battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, on down, and marched forth into their ignominy. And of course, the higher-ups, all the way from the White House on down, set that train in motion by very consciously and deliberately giving that unlawful order. They're very conscious of it because the president, according to a statute, is required to make some certifications to Congress, and the president falsely certified, he perjured himself to Congress to get Congress to appropriate what he was doing, saying, I'm doing something else. Okay, so it's very conscious. But just let's talk about the battalion level down. You might say Michael New failed because his solitary faithfulness failed to bring his chain to a conscious getting back within the bounds of the law. Well, you can argue that. But, and you'd be right partially, but that ripple of only a lowly E4 has continued to ripple, and it's my opinion, and it's only my opinion, on good evidence, but I don't have evidence that is infallible, that act of faithfulness continues to ripple today and to cow the contemplated lawlessness of very many servants in high places to this day. A lowly E4. Imagine if the man sergeant had the sense and the understanding. Again, we're largely a nation of constitutionally illiterate people today, but again, that's easily remediable. All they have to do is read it, it's right there. Okay? What if, as lieutenant, had said, boy, you're right, Specialist New. This is unlawful. And then behind closed doors, gone to his captain. And the captain had blown him off, but he insisted on seeing the major. And the major had blown him off, but he had insisted on seeing the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel. And what if that Lieutenant Colonel had said, "You're right"? My point is that it takes a relatively small proportion of consciously faithful public servants to diffuse a lot of potential crises that have plunged other republics to their deaths, either by Caesarism or Romans. Again, no constitutional mechanism, no set of constitutional principles will save you from utter civic depravity as a people, and indolence, and ignorance, and indifference. But it requires only a relatively smaller portion of general civic virtue in the citizenry, and only a relatively small portion of intelligent, conscious fidelity in the class of public servants under this absolutely wonderful civic order to prevent some ugly things. So, again, Oath Keepers, Oath Keepers again, our mission in Oath Keepers, we who are public servants still, is threefold. Mutually remind each other of the sacredness of the oath. That is the condition, the legal condition of our wearing our uniforms and exercising that military might of the United States. Mutually educate each other in the particulars of what the Constitution actually has to say about the military powers and their distribution and investment and how they're to be used as it applies to our particular station. Remember, Cicero taught us that your duty is dependent on your office. In his office, as it describes how if you are a father, your duty is one thing. If you are a brigade commander, yours is another. What does the Constitution have to say specifically to me in my particular role? And third, mutually steel each other's resolve to be faithful to that oath. Come any compulsion, come any persuasion, come any threat, come any deception. And for the private citizens among us, again, a threefold mission. You private citizens, those of you who are private citizens and are therefore the lawful masters of all of us who are public servants, is to remind our public servants of that oath, that is the condition of their offices, to educate your public servants in the particulars of the Constitution as it speaks to their office and duties and powers, and to hold them responsible. Anyway, thank you.
That was, he could say he's mediocre all he wants, but that was masterful. So I think that is, as far as I'm concerned, the best explanation of the mission of Oath Keepers and the obligations of the oath that I've ever heard. So I think it's very, very fortunate to have him here. What we'll do is a 5-minute break, come back and get into questions for Commander Gillie. I believe we have ample time to do a short question and answer session after a 5-minute break. I think it's easier with Hitler. Is also an excellent example of this right of what he was saying. They had to break their oath to save the country. So anyway, any questions you have, please step forward, don't be shy. Now is the time to ask. No such thing as a dumb question. Well, they're kind of good, but at least, keep it within the topic at hand and ask him about his what he just taught you.
But why did those poor German officers face that conundrum? Because they did not have our single order. No one else has. Brutus and the conspirators were in the same position that some of these German good men were in. The Roundheads in England were in the same position vis-a-vis the Caesar in their midst, Charles Stuart. There was no lawful way to save the law that they could find short of violating the law. And I maintain that that is just a horrendous position to ever be in. And we should be thanking our Heavenly Father that we are not pushed in that position in our country because of that one principle of oaths that I talked about and that one feature of constitutional form of the Unitarianness. Many reasons we should count ourselves blessed.
Before anybody asks a question, just be aware that you'll be on CNN, or at least they're taping it, so just as long as you're okay with that, you're giving your consent by asking the question. Okay?
And I appreciate Stuart and everybody else being really nice, calling me commander and everything, because I just got promoted. They know how much it means to me. But please remember, I'm here as David Gillie in no official capacity. The Navy has public affairs officers to make public statements on behalf of the Navy. I am an American who happens to be a military officer, but I'm here as an oath keeper's board member in that capacity. But thank you guys, flattering my ego. I really do appreciate it. Yes.
Yeah, Commander Gillie, I asked you earlier about standing down. Stuart talked about standing down with unlawful orders. You were talking about it a little bit just now, but can you maybe expand on that? Why a soldier would not be obligated to maybe turn his gun on an officer who gave an unlawful order, and why standing down is what oath keepers would do?
Okay, again, this is David Gillie's understanding, which, again, is not perfect, but I dare to say my civic understanding is as good as that of anyone I've ever met, so I know that sounds terrible. I've read the damn thing, okay? I've memorized it. It doesn't make me perfect, because there's much room for, argument here and there. You remember the warrant officer at Gillie? He did just that. I maintain, and I've had long arguments with a man who is brilliant, and he's certainly my superior in training. He's a 4-time recovering Harvard graduate. But long arguments on this. He would argue that warrant was within the law. I argue, look at the constitutional structure. He was without the law. He was within the natural law. Okay? And we all know that the natural law precedes all positive law, and that includes our constitutional order. But one of the reasons why we have you swear an oath to a particular constitution, a particular set of words, is that if you and I disagree about the requirements of the natural law, this warrant could see that killing women and children was unlawful intrinsically, malum per se. He could see that. And he took that gun and he turned it on his superior and said, "You shoot another one, I'll shoot you," whatever he said, okay? And he was justified in the court-martial, and Callie was not. But I argue, one of the reasons we swear that oath is the recognition that even the best of men, not the depraved, but even the best of men will disagree about what is their natural duty under the natural law, and that's why we, the sovereign citizens, have created a particular, very right there, black and white Constitution, and required all those who bear weapons in our behalf to swear an oath as a condition of their bearing weapons in our behalf. So that even when our Constitution may be, they think, and they may be right, insufficient in the face of the natural law, they have sworn an oath. And that's the condition, and they're stuck in it. If you were an officer in 1850 of the United States government, or a constable in Massachusetts, your oath to the Constitution may have required you to do something that is inherently unlawful. Specifically, Frederick Douglass, let's imagine he was caught on his escape, okay? And Mr. Lloyd in Maryland, in accordance with the constitutional provision in our Constitution, applies through the state government apparatus in the state of Massachusetts. My boy has run away. You are required by the oath that you swore to the imperfect positive constitutional law as constable to cooperate in remanding him to his reputed owner. I say reputed because, of course, you can't own another man, but the law recognized that fiction. And you swore that oath. And so I'm saying that warrant, in my reading of the law, was wrong, even though he was justified by a higher law. He was wrong, and he swore to God that he would obey the Constitution. The Constitution gives no way for him to turn his gun on his superior, even in lawlessness. But it does require that he not participate and he not execute lawlessness. Anyway, I've gone round and round with Dr. Vieira, who I will admit is my superior on that point.
I have one point to that. One point is that in our Constitution, the right to jury trial is preserved. And so if a person were convicted, like back at the time of the controversies over the enforcement of fugitive slave laws, there were many juries who refused to convict people who were part of the Underground Railroad concealing slaves that had fled from their masters. Even if found out, even if prosecuted, perhaps by an officer who didn't want to, but felt he was obligated to, arrested and then prosecuted, the jury would acquit. And under the full power of the jury, that's their lawful place. They are not sworn to enforce a law, even if it's deemed constitutional or is in violation of what they consider to be justice. They do have the power to judge the law as well as the fact. And that's one of the historic examples of what's now called jury nullification. But what it really is a jury using its just and lawful power to be the safety valve, to be the check, even where good men go wrong and write bad laws. Even if a law is, even at the time, considered to be constitutional, still a violation of natural rights, a jury has the power to set that person free. This is the safety valve of the jury. And that's not, and this is not some kind of anomaly. People say, well, jury nullification is some kind of, we don't want people running around deciding what the law. Well, look at the pardoning power of the president, or clemency by a governor. These are safety valves designed to prevent injustice.